First, he Googled what happens when your spouse disappears. Then, his wife vanished. Next, he went on TV begging for her return before massive amounts of her blood were found inside their home. After all of this, he was arrested, and now, 5 months after Mamta Bhatt first went missing, her husband is charged with her murder. I'm Gillespie, and this is Law&Crime News. The case of Mamta Bhatt is full of twists and turns, to say the least. This story takes us back to July in Manassas Park, Virginia. That's just about 30 minutes outside of DC. That's where Mamta Bhatt lived with her husband, Naresh Bhatt, and their 1-year-old daughter. Mamta worked as a registered nurse in nearby Manassas, Virginia, at the University of Virginia Health Prince William Medical Center. It was actually Mamta's co-workers at this hospital who sounded the alarm when she failed to show up for one of her shifts. The last day anyone for sure saw Mamta was July 28th. That same day, she posted a TikTok of her baby crawling up the stairs, but after that, her social media went dark. She was scheduled to work the following week, but never showed up. So on August 1st, her coworkers called police asking for a wellness check. The next day, on August 2nd, police visited Mamta's home, and that's when her husband Naresh spoke with law enforcement for the first time.
He's not at the work.
Her employer called and asking, just called us to check if she was okay. So that's why we're here. We don't mean to bother you.
No, that's fine. She's supposed to be there. Usually, I don't know, I cannot check, where she goes.
Naresh told police that he'd last seen Mamta on July 31st. However, she was safe just visiting her relatives in either New York or Texas.
She, on Wednesday, she left and then she says she's gonna go either New York or Texas, and then she left, she had the phone and then she destroyed that phone and then she left.
So she destroyed the phone and she left. She said she was going to New York.
Yeah, her sister, one of her sister.
The problem with all of this is that investigators later discovered Mamta doesn't have any family in New York or Texas. Naresh spoke with police again, though, on August 5th when he finally reported Mamta missing. She was labeled as an involuntary or critical missing person. As Mamta's case started to gain steam, reporters actually spoke with Naresh. He claimed his wife had gone missing 3 times before this. He also told reporters he missed her and was waiting for her safe return. It was August 21st when the home Mamta shared with Naresh was searched by police. We've since learned they executed at least 10 search warrants by that point, and they'd also conducted hundreds of interviews. The following day, on August 22nd, Naresh was escorted from the home in handcuffs. At this point, Mamta's family was granted an emergency visa to leave Nepal and come to the United States to get custody of their granddaughter. The following day, Naresh was arraigned on charges of prohibition against concealment of a body. Now, it's important to note at that point, Naresh was not charged in Mamta's murder. But according to some damning evidence, Naresh was the main suspect in her disappearance and death. Investigators looked through Naresh's internet history, finding searches dating back to April for things like how long does it take to get married after a spouse dies, and what happened to died spouse. Okay, I know you're multitasking when you're watching our videos, and if you happen to be out and running errands, listen up. I have to tell you about this free app called Upside that gets you cash back on daily essentials. It's something I use every time I pump gas because it's so easy and it's free, so why not? Here's all you have to do. Just download the Upside app and then claim an offer for whatever you're buying. Just pay as usual and follow the steps on the app to get paid. To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on your screen and use our promo code LCNews to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. According to court documents, Naresh was seen at Walmart on July 30th. At that time, he bought a pack of 3 knives. But when the search warrant was later executed at his home, investigators only found 1. Prosecutors now allege Naresh used 1 or all of these knives to murder Mamta in their home on July 29th. 2 days later, on July 30th, Naresh was back at Walmart, and this time he bought cleaning supplies. These were later recovered when police executed those search warrants. Also inside the family home, investigators found blood pooling in the bedroom and the bathroom, almost as if someone had dragged a body through those rooms. Experts say based on the amount of blood that was found inside the home, the victim wouldn't have been able to survive. Just this month, authorities confirmed the blood matched up with Mamta's DNA. They also say evidence shows Mamta's body was likely cut into pieces. Mamta is now presumed dead, but still, a body has yet to be found. Even so, Virginia prosecutors moved forward with a charge against Naresh. On September 5th, he waived his rights to a grand jury proceeding and was granted a speedy trial. That trial for the concealment of a body charge was set to begin next week, but this week, things got more complicated. On Monday, a grand jury indicted Naresh on 2 charges of first-degree murder and physically defiling a dead body. To take a deep dive into this case, we're turning to Virginia criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Diane Toscano. Diane, thank you for coming on with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this case has seen a lot of ups and downs. First, we have our victim went missing, then her husband's arrested but not charged with her murder. Now, almost half a year later, he's finally charged with her murder. Why do you think it would have taken so long for these murder charges to come down?
Well, I think it makes sense because, as you heard from reports from the police, at the time they did the first initial search warrant, clearly they felt that a murder had happened and that, in fact, the wife had been murdered. But there's no body, and there was no body at the time. They waited for the DNA evidence to come back. That just came in, I think, according to reports, that it matches the wife's DNA. So that's why the charges, I think, just came out for murder.
You mentioned something very vital in this case, that we don't have a body. Mamta Bhatt's body has yet to be found. Does that make things more challenging for the prosecution because we don't have a body?
Well, of course, a prosecutor is going to want to have the body. They are proceeding in a murder case if they can. But there are cases, although rare, where they do go forward without bodies. In those cases, a lot of times a prosecutor is going to look to circumstantial evidence, and here it's circumstantial and DNA, and really build their case with all the different evidence that they have in order to try to create that beyond a reasonable doubt standard that they have to prove to show that the defendant committed this murder. So in this case, the prosecutor is going to rely heavily on the DNA evidence. I believe reports suggest or say that the defendant had left his house on occasion, removing bags that they brought to the trash. Cleaning supplies had been purchased. I think internet searches had been done. So the prosecutor is going to have to build a case on circumstantial evidence. So if a prosecutor can have it their way, they're going to have something on surveillance video, a body, DNA, as much evidence as possible. But they're going to have to work with what they have in this case.
Let's talk about the evidence. You mentioned we have both the circumstantial and then the DNA. So let's start with the circumstantial because it seems like we have an overwhelming amount of that. There are some Google searches that were made back in April. So she went missing in July, so a couple of months before all of that. And apparently he's searching how long does it take to get married after a spouse dies. He looks specifically in Virginia. When your spouse dies, what happens to your debt? Kind of giving us the inclination that he believes his spouse is going to die, and then she disappears and is now presumed dead. Are these as incriminating as they seem?
Well, of course, when you go to a jury trial, that's evidence the prosecutor is going to want to be able to get in before a jury. All of the evidence together is going to be what the prosecutor needs to add up to show that this murder has happened and that the alleged defendant's the one who committed it, not alleged, but has actually committed it. Right now, the way it stands in Virginia, when you go to the grand jury, which is what has happened in this case, the murder charge has been brought by the grand jury. That's a very low burden. It's just showing that a probable cause, more likely than not, this individual committed the crime. But right now, with the grand jury certifying a murder indictment, it doesn't mean that he has committed this offense beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's going to be the job of the prosecutor. So certainly those Google searches are going to come in as what they're going to present as very damning evidence to show a motive, to show why, in fact, the defendant would have committed this crime. Just as the defense is going to want to have a story to explain away what happened, the prosecutor is going to want to have a story to explain what did happen.
I feel like we can almost guess what story the prosecution would turn out for the jury. We've talked about those incriminating Google searches, but then you also mentioned surveillance video. We actually have this of him going to Walmart several times, first buying multiple knives, and then a second time he's buying some cleaning supplies that are later found at this crime scene, or what investigators believe is the crime scene. Obviously, this is pretty circumstantial, but it does go to show maybe he tried to clean up the scene. Is that a win for prosecutors?
That certainly is another check in their column to try to show that this is a case that's beyond a reasonable doubt that an individual committed the murder. They're going to put that together with all the other circumstantial evidence that they have.
Additionally, we first saw this defendant when he appeared on local TV stations, basically coming out and saying, I miss my wife. I'm not sure where she is. I hope she returns safely. So we have these local TV reports of him saying all this, and then he's later accused of her murder. Could those local TV station clips actually be brought in at trial?
That's something that, depending on the defense's theme of the case and the prosecution, each of them may want to use that depending on what they're trying to prove in their case or trying to defend in their case. So yes, I think that's going to come into play. There certainly may be pretrial motions trying to keep out some of those statements. I think the defense may end up wanting to try to keep some of those statements out and not come in before the jury. So I think it will be a litigated issue, but I can see the prosecution wanting that to come in play. And maybe even the defense attorney. I know the defense attorney, I think, has put out that they're maintaining that she's alive and hopefully she's going to show up. So that seems to be doubt that they're trying to put out in order to help her client's case.
I want to talk about the defense, but first I want to get through all of the evidence. We talked about the circumstantial, but let's talk about DNA also. We mentioned this at the top of the interview that there was Mamta Bhatt's DNA found. Enough blood, the investigators say this much blood loss, the person could not have survived. So we have her DNA there, enough blood, okay, she probably didn't survive, but we don't have a body. Is that DNA evidence still a win for the prosecution?
Is a positive for the prosecution, but I will tell you, as a defense attorney, I'm sure the defense is going to try to put out or look into, who has access to the home? Do other people come and go in the home? Who's typically in the home? And try to look into how her DNA could have ended up in that room, but not necessarily that the defendant is the one who murdered her.
You are a good guest to have on because you have experience on both sides of the aisle, the prosecution and the defense attorney side, which is what I'm going to ask about now. You've mentioned this a couple times throughout the interview that he maintains his innocence. Naresh Bhatt says he didn't do it, and his defense is going to come forward with some sort of story. Can you infer or imagine what you think they're going to present when it comes time for jury trial?
So I know when I handle my cases, and if I have a murder case like this, first his attorney is going to sit down and talk with him, find out as much detail and information from the husband as the attorney can get. And then also look at what is going to be turned over to the defense in discovery, meaning, the videos, if there's surveillance videos, the DNA that came back, the Google searches, all the evidence that the Commonwealth has, they're going to present to the defense attorney. So as a defense attorney, I'm always looking at what is our story? Why did this happen to his wife? What is our story to the jury about how come he's sitting in the defendant's chair? So at this stage, I don't know. But again, as I said, I would look at who else has access to the home. I would look at each of their relationships. I would look at so many things in order to try to figure out what would my defense be for my client.
Talking about the defense a bit more, I am always wondering whether the defendant is going to take this stand. It's just something we always talk about, doesn't always necessarily happen. But I'm wondering in this case if potentially he would take this stand. I mean, he's already been outspoken. He talked to local media, so we heard his voice there. What is the process like going to be for all of that? Obviously, it's up to the defendant to decide, okay, yes, I'm going to take the stand, or no, I'm not. But what would the discussions between his defense attorney and him look like?
So that's a great question. One of the major things I would look at with my client is all the prior statements he made. If he testifies, those statements could very well then certainly come out in front of the jury if they're an inconsistent statement to attack his credibility. So I'm sure his attorney is going to look at all of the statements he's made up to today and then counsel the client on whether or not testifying is the right thing to do. As you said, it's the defendant's constitutional right. But I always advise my clients what I think they should do, and hopefully a client's going to listen to the attorney, but he may very well take the stand, and his attorney may think that's what's best for this case. They're going to have to spend time together. And one of the things I also look at when I'm meeting with my client is how our interactions are. When I speak with the client, how do they answer questions? How do they handle those questions? So a lot goes into whether or not a defense attorney is going to recommend that their client actually take the stand and make a statement. So I don't know what he's going to do, but I think that's a great question.
It's always a balancing act, too, because the defendant, if they want to come forward and tell their story, if they're maintaining their innocence and pleading not guilty, maybe they do want to speak out and say what they saw happen or didn't see happen. However, then that exposes them to cross-examination. If he does decide to take the stand, Naresh Bhatt, how would his team prepare him for the cross-examination that I'm sure the Commonwealth would bring, and it would probably be pretty strong?
So I am sure his attorneys are going to practice asking him questions, get him used to these are the questions that may come your way if you take the stand. So he can start thinking about how he's going to answer those questions. But it's going to take a lot of preparing, I'm sure. And again, it may, depending on how he does, they'll decide whether or not him testifying is the best thing or not. But in these situations, sometimes a defendant wants to be heard, and especially if they're maintaining their innocence, they want to be able to have their time in court, to have their voice, and be able to advocate for themselves. So it's a balance. It's certainly a difficult, I'm sure, a difficult decision for him to make.
We're talking today because he was charged with her murder, but several months ago, we reported on this story back then too, because he was charged with concealment of a body. So back in September, he waived his right to a speedy trial. Back in September, he said, yes, we're hoping for a speedy trial, and that was set for next week, actually. So he was charged in the concealment of a body in this same case, headed to trial next week, but now we have this new charge. Does that complicate things for this trial that was expected to start just next week?
Yes, I think so. I'm sure his attorney is frustrated because I'm sure the team is preparing for jury next week. But now with this new charge, most likely the jury trial is going to get continued, and they'll try both of these charges together at the same time.
We've talked about a lot of things on both sides, the defense and the prosecution. Do you think that they have a strong case, the prosecution?
I think this is an interesting and difficult case, but I think certainly the prosecution feels much better now that the DNA evidence is in, and it confirms, in fact, that it is the wife's blood. I'm sure that the prosecutor is looking at, although circumstantial, the evidence that exists as they put it together will build a case. And I know that the prosecutors come out and said they feel they have a strong case, but it's never an easy case when you don't have a body. It's just not. So this is a case where they may be discussing plea negotiations at some time. There's pros and cons to both the defendant in this case and the prosecutor in this case.
I like what you said about this, that it's an interesting and difficult case, because it definitely is. There are a lot of layers. Diane, thanks for coming on and talking through it with us.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Since his arrest this summer, Naresh has been held in jail. He's still there and has been denied bond twice. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.